U.S. warships are now sitting at the entrance of the world's most important oil choke point, and what happens in the next 72 hours will determine where Asia gets its energy for the next decade. 20 million barrels of oil pass through this strait every single day. 80% of it goes to Asia. And right now, Washington controls whether it moves. This is not just about Iran. This is about whether America can use one strait to rewrite the entire global energy map, and the evidence says it already has. The official line is narrow. CENTCOM says neutral ships can still transit the Strait of Hormuz if they are not going to Iranian ports. But markets do not trade on press release wording. They trade on risk, insurance, routing uncertainty, and the possibility that one wrong course change turns a commercial voyage into a military incident. That is where the real story begins. Hormuz normally carries about 20 million barrels a day of oil and products, around a quarter of world seaborne oil trade, and roughly 80% of those flows are destined for Asia. So when this choke point seizes up, the first system under real stress is not Europe. It is the industrial belt stretching from India to China, Japan, and Korea. And oil is only half the picture. The IEA says about 93% of Qatar's LNG exports and 96% of the UAE's LNG exports pass through Hormuz, together representing roughly 19% of global LNG trade. There are some crude bypass routes. There is no clean substitute route for that gas, so even a selective blockade creates a global LNG problem. The headline version says, "America is squeezing Iran." The deeper reality is that America is also stress testing every refinery, tanker fleet, insurer, and treasury desk that depends on Gulf energy arriving on schedule. This is a much larger contest because it is really about which economies can absorb disruption, substitute cargoes, and outbid their rivals fastest when the old route stops behaving like a normal trade lane. That pressure did not begin with the blockade announcement itself. The IEA says the war that began on February 28th created the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. By March, crude and oil product flows through Hormuz had fallen from around 20 million barrels a day to just over 2 million. That is not noise. That is systemic shock. Gulf producers responded by cutting output hard because storage was filling up and export options were constrained. The IEA says total oil production cuts in the region exceeded 14 million barrels a day, while refining capacity also went offline because feedstock could not move and export outlets were no longer reliable. This is a physical dislocation, not a paper squeeze invented by traders. And that is the missing narrative. The story is no longer simply whether Iran can withstand pressure. The story is whether the United States can combine maritime enforcement, Atlantic basin supply, and market fear into a new kind of leverage that leaves Asia paying the highest strategic price. That is the Atlantic pivot in one sentence. Start with the timeline. The broader war had already disrupted shipping for weeks. Then, on April 12th, CENTCOM announced that, beginning April 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. forces would implement a blockade on all maritime traffic entering or exiting Iranian ports. That made the military architecture explicit. It turned existing chaos into declared policy. Officially, the measure was narrower than a total closure of Hormuz. CENTCOM said it would not impede freedom of navigation to non-Iranian ports, and Reuters reported that humanitarian shipments would still be allowed subject to inspection. That distinction matters legally and diplomatically. It matters less to a shipowner who has to decide whether sending a $100 million vessel into a war zone is smart. Reuters reported that as the blockade took effect, at least 2 vessels turned back after approaching the strait. That detail matters because modern energy markets watch ship tracking screens like cardiograms. The moment tankers begin reversing course, the whole ecosystem starts recalculating risk, from chartering desks in Singapore to insurers in London and refiners in Northeast Asia. But the first full day also revealed the limits of simple official narratives. Reuters reported that at least 8 ships, including 3 Iran-linked tankers, still crossed the waterway. CENTCOM said no ships made it past the blockade toward Iranian ports in the first 24 hours. Those statements can both be technically true. They still describe very different realities. That discrepancy tells you how blockades actually function in the modern era. The formal rule may be selective. The market effect is broader because operators self-deter long before every boundary is clarified. A tanker does not need to be captured for the system to freeze. It only needs to become economically irrational to send it forward. If you want analysis that separates official messaging from physical reality, this is the moment to subscribe to Signal Drop and turn on notifications. Because once you follow the barrels instead of the speeches, this crisis stops looking like a narrow anti-Iran measure and starts looking like something much larger. Stay with us. Before the war, industry sources told Reuters that more than 130 vessels crossed Hormuz daily. After the war and blockade, traffic was only a fraction of that. Reuters also reported comments from the International Maritime Organization's Secretary General saying around 1,600 vessels and 20,000 seafarers were stuck in the Gulf. That is a shipping paralysis story as much as an oil story. Prices reacted the way choke point crises always do, fast, then unevenly. Reuters reported Brent settled at $99.36 a barrel and WTI at $99.08 on April 12th after the blockade announcement, following even sharper intraday spikes. That price action matters, but it is only the surface. The more important shift was what buyers started doing behind the scenes to replace missing or unreliable barrels. That is where this stops being a Middle East story and becomes a map story. Once Hormuz volumes are unsafe, the buying program shifts westward. Atlantic Basin crude becomes more attractive not because it is ideal, but because it is reachable, insurable, and politically safer. Replacement behavior is the beginning of strategic realignment. Asia is the center of gravity here. The IEA says 80% of the oil and oil products that moved through Hormuz in 2025 went to Asia, and China and India alone received 44% of the crude exports. So when Washington squeezes this corridor, the most immediate industrial pain lands in the Eastern Hemisphere, where manufacturing demand and import dependence are both enormous. Now get more specific. Replacing Gulf crude is not like swapping one battery for another. Much of Asia's refining system was built around medium and heavy sour grades from the Middle East. That means lighter Atlantic crude can create operational compromises, different product yields, and less efficient runs. The replacement barrel may keep the plant alive, but it may not keep the economics intact. Reuters reported that Japanese refiners were running at just 67.8% capacity in the week to April 11th, far below pre-war levels above 80%. It also reported that Japan historically sourced about 95% of its oil imports from the Middle East, and that experts assessed only 30% to 50% of those lost volumes may be replaceable in the short term. That is a brutal vulnerability. The crude mismatch also changes the product slate. Reuters reported that a shift toward lighter crude can mean more gasoline and naphtha output, but less diesel and jet fuel, exactly the kind of imbalance that matters when transport systems and industrial users are already dealing with tight supply. So even successful substitution can produce the wrong mix of fuels. Argus reported this week that U.S. light sweet crude has emerged as a leading substitute for Middle Eastern heavy and medium sour grades that are stuck at or unable to transit Hormuz. It also said a record 3.5 million barrels a day of U.S. crude is expected to arrive in Asia-Pacific for June delivery. That is not incremental. That is rerouting at scale. People call that arbitrage, which is fair as far as it goes. But this is not just traders spotting a temporary spread. It is a procurement scramble caused by a strategic break in the old system. The fallback supplier with the largest combination of production flexibility, export infrastructure, and relative security is now increasingly outside the Gulf. And the logistics themselves make the market tighter. When crude has to travel farther from the Atlantic Basin to Asia, tankers stay occupied longer, freight costs become more important, and delivery timing gets less forgiving. You do not need fewer barrels for the system to feel tighter. Sometimes you only need the same barrels to take much longer to arrive. The immediate winners are not hard to spot. U.S. Gulf Coast exporters gain from having domestic supply and a viable export platform. Atlantic Basin producers gain pricing power. Shipping owners benefit from longer haul demand and elevated war risk pricing. Markets do not need a speech from Washington to understand the incentive structure. It is written into the roots. The immediate losers are even easier to identify. Asian refiners pay more for replacement cargoes, face equipment limits in processing them, and risk cutting runs when supply cannot arrive in time. Reuters reported buyers in Asia were already hunting for crude from Brazil, West Africa, Russia, and the United States just to manage the shortfall created by the Hormuz disruption. Europe is less directly exposed to Gulf crude than Asia, but it still gets hit through price and competition. Reuters reported that European refining margins had turned negative, even as margins in the U.S. Gulf and Singapore remained stronger, partly because crude prices surged and buyers elsewhere were bidding aggressively for alternative supplies. That is second-order pain, but it is real pain. We are halfway through the full picture, and the next section is the one most financial coverage is missing entirely. The LNG dimension of this crisis and what it means for gas security across Asia. Subscribe to Signal Drop right now so you never miss this level of analysis. Back to the story. Then come back to LNG because this is where the risk gets nastier. The IEA says there are no alternative routes to market for the LNG volumes from Qatar and the UAE that normally pass through Hormuz. Most of that gas goes to Asia, with just over 10% heading to Europe. So gas security, like oil security, bends eastward in this crisis. This is why the phrase selective blockade only tells part of the truth. Even if neutral passage remains formally allowed, persistent insecurity at Hormuz changes contract behavior, stockpile strategy, and import planning. It rewards suppliers outside the Gulf, penalizes buyers optimized for Gulf flows, and pushes the market toward a new geography whether anyone officially declares one or not. And yet the United States cannot simply replace the region on command. The IEA says there is only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels a day of potential crude export capacity that might bypass Hormuz through alternative routes, and even that has not been fully tested under stress at sustained scale. The system can bend, it cannot bend forever. That is why the blockade's success is not the same thing as total control. There is evidence of porosity. Reuters reported ships still crossed on the first full day, and the possibility of evasion and dark fleet activity remains real. So the relevant question is not whether the net is perfect, it is whether the fear is strong enough. By April 17th, the contradiction was even sharper. Reuters reported that after Iranian officials said the strait was open during a temporary ceasefire, around 20 vessels began moving toward Hormuz, but most soon halted or turned back. The biggest concern flagged by shipping companies was not a press statement. It was unresolved security risk, especially the threat of mines. That detail matters because a choke point does not have to be fully sealed to change the world economy. It only has to become unreliable enough that private actors start behaving as though the worst case is always one misfire away. In maritime trade, fear has tonnage. Delay has a cost curve. Ambiguity is not a side effect. It becomes part of the mechanism. ACLED noted that after the blockade took effect on April 13th, recorded direct violence inside Iran appeared to drop as both sides sought a diplomatic breakthrough, and Tehran proposed safe passage for shipping through the Omani side of Hormuz, as talks were expected to resume in Pakistan. That means coercion and negotiation are now running in parallel. So, what is the blockade actually doing? Based on available reporting, it is not producing a clean, total maritime denial. It is doing something politically more useful. It is tightening pressure on Iran while forcing the wider market to internalize U.S. enforcement power as an ongoing variable in the movement of Gulf energy. That is a subtler form of control. This is the core contradiction. Officially, Washington says neutral passage remains open. In practice, insurers, ship owners, and refiners behave as though access to Gulf energy now depends on a military situation they do not control. The market hears conditional passage, not free navigation. That difference is where strategic leverage lives. That is why the phrase Atlantic pivot works. The United States is not replacing OPEC in the old sense. It is combining maritime enforcement, shale-backed export capability, and the gravitational pull of Atlantic supply into a new kind of energy influence. Not absolute control, but enough influence to force rival economies into expensive, longer, less efficient fallback choices. If that sounds like an energy weapon, it is because it functions like one, not the old producer embargo model, a newer version where the decisive advantage comes from determining which routes are secure, which cargoes are insurable, and which importers must scramble across oceans to cover a gap they did not create but still have to survive. The hidden cost is that leverage cuts both ways. Every extra voyage from the Atlantic basin to Asia raises freight exposure. Every refinery pushed off its preferred crude slate loses efficiency. Every week of uncertainty encourages emergency buying and defensive behavior that can persist long after the shooting slows. Power gained through disruption always creates collateral strain. That creates a consequence most headlines still miss. Even if the talks in Pakistan reduce violence, commercial confidence will not rebound overnight. Shipping companies that spent weeks pausing sailings, checking mine advisories, and revising war risk assumptions are not going to pretend the pre-war system still exists just because one weekend headline sounds calmer. Asian governments and firms are likely to respond by accelerating changes that were already underway but could still be postponed. Larger strategic inventories, more non-Gulf supply contracts, more refinery flexibility, and greater political urgency around alternative corridors. The logic of dependence has now been exposed in public. And once that happens, old complacency gets harder to sell. For Washington, the upside is obvious. This crisis demonstrates that American energy power no longer rests only on sanctions policy or production volume. It also rests on the ability to shape risk perception at the world's most important oil choke point, while sitting inside part of the replacement supply system from the Atlantic side. That is a serious form of leverage. But there is a limit, and it matters. This strategy works best when it coerces behavior without breaking the market beyond repair. If disruption deepens and alternatives prove insufficient, the same pressure that weakens rivals can also hit allies with inflation, industrial strain, and political backlash. Energy power is real. It is just never clean, and it is never free. That is the real significance of Hormuz in April 2026. The question is no longer just who can close a strait, survive a blockade, or win a headline. The real question is who can reroute the world after the choke point breaks. Right now, Washington is trying to prove that the answer is America. This is Signal Drop. If this breakdown helped you see the map more clearly, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next story we are tracking is the one that explains what happens when the ceasefire holds, but the energy system does not recover. Which economies absorb the damage quietly, and which ones crack first? That story drops next. Don't miss it.